So well done for making it on time. This is not meant to be a long introduction. I've talked about resilience. I think there could not be a better word to talk about Asia and the Asian future than resilience. And without much further ado, I will call on Hina, who is actually waiting for a coffee. So I'll start with Siddharth. Please join me, Siddharth MOHANDAS from Lazard, Director at Lazard Geopolitical Advisory. And Hina, but take your juice, it's fine. And Hina, whom we no longer introduce because you're actually here at least twice a year, every year, and we're very privileged to have you. You served twice at the helm of the Foreign Ministry of Pakistan. You were the first woman to become Foreign Minister of Pakistan, and you now chair the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament. So there would be much to talk about in an introduction. But I'd like to do something simple and reflect on the title. We called it the Asian Century, the Eastern Century, and the future is Asian. We tend to see Asia as one block. And we see now that the geopolitical fragmentation tends to make different blocks stand out. So how do you see it? Do you see it from inside Asia and outside, that you see one block, or is it more complex?
No, I think Asia is actually almost like a patchwork of so many different cultures, so many different ethnicities, so many different people, and so many different geographies. And it's very interesting because typically Asia is considered to be like this one homogeneous block. If you look at just the landmass, Asia is 5 times that of Europe. And you see the diversity in Europe, and we recognize that. But when you look at Asia, we typically want to look at perhaps India representative of Asia or China representative of Asia, but geographically only, if you go around, you have, starting from the Southeast Asia, where the birth of the Asian tigers came, and that was all fine because it was almost on the model of liberal economic policies propelled and professed by the West, and it was all celebrated and good. And then you move forward and come to, so Southeast Asia, then South Asia. South Asia in itself is a whole conglomerate, yeah? And then you have the Central Asian republics, very different culturally, geographically, economically, ethnically, and almost like different worlds altogether. And then you come to the Middle East. Again, a whole different world, okay? A whole different set of economies, a whole different types of technology, what they're dealing with. So whether you look at culturally, you look at geographically, you look at what they're doing at what time in history, there could be so many Asian stories. So, but we still want to look at Asia as a big block. So the Asia of the big block today is contributing about 47% to the global GDP, and 27% of that is outside of what we only know to be the contributors of global GDP, which is China and India. So that's the reality of Asia. And then historically also, the journeys that they've gone through are so distinct and so different. So to look at it as one big block would be a mistake, I think, in many different ways.
Siddharth, you also see, you might see things differently. So you now on the private sector, you were the State Department Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense for Asia for 2 years. You actually played an instrumental role in the negotiation of AUKUS. Coming from France, I can't say it was great work you did, but that's another breakfast.
So we're friends now.
Yeah, but and you did a lot to strengthen the partnership with Japan, Australia, the Republic of Korea. How do you look at the title?
Yeah, well, it's the part of the title that I would key off on is actually the first part where you say the future is Asian, because when you talk about the U.S. policy, the notion of a U.S. pivot to Asia, the concept of a rebalance is another term that's been used. I think the core animating idea behind it is a belief at the highest levels of American policy that the future is Asian and the future for America is tied to Asia. And to this audience here this morning, I don't think I need to persuade anyone of that. I think the facts are well known that if in the next 10, 15 years, 40% of global consumption will be out of Asia, 50% of GDP, as Hina noted, 60% of technology revenues. And so when you look at the most economically dynamic, prosperous, on-the-move region in the world today going forward, it is going to be Asia. And so what you see in U.S. policy is a recognition that the security and prosperity of Americans is inextricably tied to the future of Asia. And so if you want to understand why do American politicians talk about a pivot to Asia, that's it. It is that fundamental belief. And I would note, two things. I mean, one, it's not actually a particularly new thing. If you look back to the earliest days of the American Republic and the China trade and tea and things like that, Asia has always actually loomed very large in how America's thought about its international engagement. But that has really taken on a new urgency in the last 10, 15 years. And the other thing I would want to emphasize is that it's bipartisan. Obama announced a pivot to Asia. He, it was promptly renamed the Rebalance. But then, Trump came in and he made great power competition with China the centerpiece of his national security strategy. And when the Biden administration came in, they continued that strategy, and particularly the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And now we're back with Trump. And so, at a moment of great division, actually, in the United States, this is one idea where there is actually true bipartisan support.
So you cover geopolitical risk. I mean, there's something you've done for decades since your time at the State Department and now at Lazard. It's interesting when you read the latest study of the Asian Research Center, who published its annual or biannual study of the mood and the state. It's a Pew Research Center of Asia, 2024, and they polled many countries and citizens across Asia, and there were two questions really interesting. One is, comparing the US and China, what do you think, what country is the most influential economic power? 60% said China, 14% said the US. Then they were asked, what country plays the greater role in ensuring local stability? 33% US, 11% China. At the same time, we see Donald Trump coming up with this tariff obsession of his, which is putting economic prosperity at risk in Asia. Don't we, having seen now the percentage of China being seen as an important economic power, that this will have implication and repercussion on the political perception of China in the region? In other words, the US losing influence.
No, look, I think that data that you cited is very interesting, and it reflects, I think, a reality that is, perceived perhaps by the experience of many countries in the region, which is that their number one trading partner is China, and their number one security partner is the United States. And that is the dichotomy that exists in Asia today, and it is one that every country in the region in its own way is seeking to manage. But crucially then, it is something that both the United States and China must seek to navigate and manage as well. It's a bit of a cliche to hear this statement that countries in the region don't want to choose between China and the United States. And of course that's true, but it's also, I'm not sure that it would even be possible to choose. Countries have deep economic ties with both China and the United States. I would note that even as China is a leading trading partner for many countries in the region, the United States is still the top investor in the region when you look at FDI measurements, particularly in Southeast Asia. But these countries also have diversified security relationships. And so the reality is that countries are choosing every day, actually, between China and the United States on different issues. And the challenge for American policy, I'll speak as a former American policymaker, is to create an incentive structure and an environment where the preponderance of those choices are those that the United States wants.
So, Hina, we've seen, I was mentioning the tariffs, USAID, there was a report that USAID, and then it's closing, to put a word on it, was putting at risk almost 2 million lives in Pakistan, including more than 1 million Afghan refugees. Tremendous potential impact on health policy with tuberculosis, amongst others. So we see a kind of addition of layers of risks that are growing. Is this all putting a kind of casting a shadow on the prospect of prosperity for the whole continent? I mean, for decades, Asia, including Pakistan, of course unevenly, but had benefited from integration in the world trade system, free trade, international development policy and cooperation, and all this seems to be crumbling within, what, a few years?
Okay, I've noted that question, but can I respond to the conversation that happened just before that? Because I thought that was very, very sophisticated, very interesting, and could have a very different take, a very different perspective, right? So when you say that the pivot of Asia happened around 2010, and at that time I happened to be the foreign minister of Pakistan, and we all celebrated the pivot to Asia because we expected it to be a happy, consolidatory Asia attention time, which is going to take Asia to places. Now, the question I don't ask myself, and I don't have an answer to that, I think the answer to that is still up in the air, open to any type of, whatever you make of it. But was that pivot to Asia to propel Asia to a better future? Or was that pivot towards Asia to contain what growth, development, technology, and possibility the beginning of a country or a region which was finding its own path in a way which could then perhaps be leading rather than following? So in how it played out since 2010, I have seen that to be less of a positive pivot and more of a negative, a containment pivot rather than a propelling pivot. So more of a partnership for the sake of preserving what used to be our domain, more than a partnership to propel this region to look at it all that it's been able to do. When we say great power competition, it's a very nice fragment of a sentence, right? So great power competition is always nice. But when competition becomes like bloody, that competition is that whoever has a comparative advantage in something, such as EVs, such as solar power, such as technology, must be able to benefit from that. But when competition becomes a little bit more containment and not at the cost of our inefficient sectors, then it becomes a bit unhealthy for the receivers. So in how it's played, because look, this might be overcomplicated, and I don't want to put layers over layers over layers, but from what I've seen in the last 25 years of being in politics and mostly last 10, 15 years of being in foreign policy management is that we live the reality of our past in how people look at us, right? So today, the United States of America, Europe, a little bit India, is enjoying its past glory and what it did to the world and not living to the consequences of what it is choosing to do today. And what we're going to see, you mentioned how people look at the United States far more, not as an economic partner perhaps, but as a security and as a rule-based order preserver and all of that. Now you see the same country coming in the way of WTO panel, because it hasn't for the last 10 years, I think, given, coming in the way of competition, being able to. You see the same country asking countries all over the world, and we are on the receiving end of it, to choose. But we were in a global village, and we were told that our industries could die because competition was good. Efficiency must reign supreme. So the world has changed in such a big way. And when I come to places like Munich, one thing I keep on, just trying to scream out is, look, you guys are so inward-looking. You are unable to zoom out and look at what you're doing from outside, from the lens of people who are looking at you from the outside and seeing this behavioral change and seeing you no more being the preservers of the rules-based order or the global goods. Which country keeps on getting out of climate change agreements? Climate change, who does not agree that climate change is the biggest threat to us right now? And that is the role that the United States and Europe typically played. You came out there and got us nuclear security. So all of that has an impact which is perhaps going to be far deeper than what you are. Do you still want me to answer the USAID questions?
That can wait a bit later. You can have a coffee refill. No, but then I would bounce back on that. Then looking at the next decade, whom do you see as a reliable partner on the longer run? Europe or the US?
Europe or the US?
Yeah. Well, it's this question or USAID? You choose.
No. This question is a far better question. Okay, so I believe that Europe, I'm a fan of Europe. I'm also a fan of the US, by the way. I'm not particularly I'm a diplomat, so I have to say that. I'm a fan of everyone. Okay, so Europe has a very unique place in the world. And I do believe, and I do, Europe has a very unique place in the world because Europe has been able to be the conscience of the world. Europe has been able to bring the world back to lessons from history. But right now, I think we seem to be in a mode where we want to repeat the mistakes of history rather than learn the lessons. And the collective lessons of history that we learned from World War I and World War II are being lost at the anvil of wanting to protect our friends with giving them impunity and exceptionalism, which did not exist before. So when your friends break the rules, you give them military assistance to break more rules and to... So it's really raw out there. It's very crude from outside, looking at Europe, the US, how they're doing. It's almost like they're taking their reputation for granted and thinking that what they did for the last 5 decades is going to hold for the next 5 decades, but what is really going to hold is your behavior today, and that is having a repercussion and impact in your reputation in a way that you cannot even imagine, right? And Siddharth said very correctly. So I looked at a map which really surprised me. This was a map, a dynamic map from 2012 to 2022 of the largest partner in all over the world, single countries. It used to be a very blue map, the US, Europe, and then became increasingly a red map. Now, what I'm saying is that that's the reality. That's the reality we have to live with. So if we keep on, and then build on from that, because the strengths that you have are absolutely mimicable in some ways, right? But rather than building on those strengths, if we become reactive and want to preserve the past, that is always very dangerous. Believe me, South Asia has lived through those consequences, so I speak with a little bit of authority on that.
So we've just seen the interconnectedness between security and the economy, and I wanted to ask you, Siddharth, building on the first question I had asked you, is how do you see the security implication for the US of a fragmentation of the global economic order, especially as it impacts Asia? I mean, you worked so much to crack successful security partnership deals.
Right.
How do you see the prospect of this being increasingly challenged, if not disrupted, by the rise of tariffs and comparable developments?
No, it's a good question, and maybe I can actually connect it to Hina's comments, which I think are very well stated, and I think this is actually a very important issue, which is how is engagement perceived in the region, and what is the basis of the legitimacy of engagement, whether it's by the United States, by China, or by Europe, or anyone else. And to me, I think there are a couple factors that I think are essential if the United States is to succeed in Asia. I think the first is to actually plug in to an organic vision of the region that makes sense to people in the region. And here I think actually the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific is actually a very important one, because you can say pivot or rebalance. People are not necessarily sure what that means. The rules-based order is much debated. But if you talk about just some basic principles, which is openness to commerce, freedom from coercion, the idea that disputes should be resolved peacefully, that's a set of principles that actually I think have fairly wide purchase, so much so that you actually see the concept, again, it's worth dwelling on the point, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific was actually articulated by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe first. It was really his idea. He then kind of presented it to the Trump administration, who adopted it and made it sort of a policy pillar of the United States. It's something that the Biden administration kept. And so it's, this was actually in many ways an Asian idea. And I think the ultimate demonstration of that is you actually see sort of Indo-Pacific strategies, not just from Japan, but from South Korea, from Australia, from ASEAN, throughout the region. And they articulate these principles that I alluded to. And so to the extent that the United States lives up to that, I think that will be important for our success. And this then, I think, connects to your point about sort of what do we do with the current environment and trade fragmentation. I think it's important to recognize a political reality in the United States, which is well-founded, which is that an increasing belief in both parties in the United States that completely free trade has been detrimental to significant portions of the American population, and particularly in terms of manufacturing jobs. And that is just a political reality that is driving policy making in both administrations. And for that reason, you know, you're not going to see the same momentum behind free trade agreements that you saw in the 1990s. We live in a different time. But to your point, it is important that the United States have an affirmative economic story to tell the region. And in this respect, I mean, you know, I think tariffs are actually a little bit of a more complex issue. To the extent that tariffs are focused on questions particularly related to Chinese overcapacity, that is actually a very widespread concern throughout not just Europe, but also many countries in the global south. It is very striking to me that Indonesia recently announced broad-ranging tariffs against Chinese goods, precisely because they were concerned about dumping of Chinese overcapacity flooding their market.
This point is...
Just the last point is, you know, but so that's tariffs. But I think in terms of trying to tell more of a positive story, we are at an amazing moment where we're living through this AI revolution. And to the extent that the United States has technology and tools to deploy that where it can actually work affirmatively with partners, particularly in Asia, on developing frontier models, on developing data centers, on developing advanced compute, that actually could be a positive story that we try and pursue in the years ahead.
Yeah, so really the importance of the narrative. I want to build on what you mentioned regarding Chinese surplus and overcapacity. If we look at one segment, and you've both talked about climate, especially in the clean tech and solar panels, everyone needs it. Mm-hmm. Pakistan, mm-hmm. Europe. China is the leader now. And we know now, with the figures, that this overcapacity won't last. I mean, within the next few years, it will go down. I mean, couldn't we use it? I know, of course, they are now being provoking now, but because you have obviously the security of the grid, and now everything is being technological, we know that there might be, you know, control of or collection of the data, by the way. But I mean, this is something that could be leveraged because Pakistan can't manufacture them. We don't manufacture them anymore. I mean, why don't we use them?
So I'll answer from a U.S. perspective, and obviously very interested in Hina's views on this. Look, I mean, there is no question that we need additional clean energy, clean tech capacity in the world, and that you know, as we go through this energy transition, we need as much as we can get. But from a U.S. perspective, the idea of becoming sort of totally dependent on subsidized Chinese technology, which, as you note, may also have potential security compromises, is basically a non-starter. And so, you know, we have seen a kind of return to vogue of industrial policy in the United States. And a key feature of that, if you look at something like the Inflation Reduction Act, is trying to incentivize production in the United States in these critical technologies of the future. And that includes solar panels, electric vehicles, battery technology. But also there are very serious security concerns. And so, you know, one of the acts of the Biden administration in its final year was to release an executive order basically banning connected vehicles of Chinese origin from the U.S. market because of concerns about the security of that technology. And I think those concerns are extremely well-founded, and any country that wants to protect its people, protect its sovereignty, would take those concerns seriously.
I mean, I'd like to turn to you, Hina, but if I'm being the dragon's advocate here, I'd say that I don't see much dependence on solar panels. I mean, you can be dependent on energy, you can be dependent on US LNG, but once you have your solar panel, you're no longer dependent.
Yeah, so look, again, I think it's really important, and I've been taught this I've learned this over time, to be broad and strategic in when you look at your choices. And I've been taught that because of Pakistan's long-term animosity with a neighbor, which has cost us greatly in the region, the subcontinent. I think the growth of subcontinent has been held back by a narrative shaping that was, by both the countries, which divided people so that, whatever. So, I've learned to be broad-minded and strategic in how to, how to look at foreign policy issues, etc. So if I were to not play any advocates and just be a rational, logical person, I would say, if you're getting subsidized technology, which is going to ensure that the climate wrath is dissipated to some extent, why not be the smart, rational person and adopt somebody else's subsidy into your, into making your grid cleaner and greener? Right? What's got to lose? What have you got to lose? In the same way, so I happen to serve in the Climate Overshoot Commission, chaired by Pascal Lamy, as a member, and I happen to represent a country which has lived through 2 climate wraths in the last literally 15 years, so the floods of 2010 and then the floods recently, just a year back, just 2 years back. And the climate wrath is so real that we will not be able to seclude ourselves based on our geography or our GDP. It is going to, and we've already seen it in Tokyo, in New York, in everywhere, okay? Now, we all know that the biggest contributor to that is fossil fuel industry, whether it's in the energy sector or emissions, car emissions. So when we get the option of EV production, which can be ramped up, which has overcapacity, and the world says, no, thank you, we would rather not, I do not understand that as a rational, logical person, and I do not see any security concerns around it, right? I see adoption of a technology which is perhaps better, cheaper, by everyone. And that's what we were told. We were living in a global village. We were told our industry could die, our steel industry died, our manufacturing industry died in Pakistan, and many other countries all over the world. We were told because Europe did it more efficiently. Adopt what is more efficient. Allow your companies to face the competition, to become efficient. And now we're told, no. Efficiency for some is important, efficiency for others is not important, and we're changing the rule book. I mean, we're literally changing the rule book. Accept it and say, yes, we're changing the rule book because we want, whatever your reasons are. I don't know what your reasons are, okay? The other thing is, I think it's important to know that while Europe and US try to go a certain way or decide to go a certain way with the rest of the world has learned some lessons which is not going to unlearn. So when we say that trade is now more tariff-bound, etc., where are the tariffs coming from? The developing world or the least developed countries or the developed world, which taught us that tariffs were no, now politically, it's expedient to have tariffs because politically people are feeling the suffering, but people are feeling the suffering in the rest of the world for a very long time. We were told that it was okay. You have to live through the suffering to become more efficient. Now, just to perhaps end with the fact, as we say that trade is suffering and FTAs are diminishing, in Asia, which is what we're talking about, back in 2000, and I had to check my notes for that, my cheat notes for that, back in 2000, we had a sum total of 8 FTAs, all between all countries in Asia, inter-Asia. Do you know how many we have now? 147, 87 on the way. What do you think Asia is reacting to? Asia is understanding that the world around it, the other continents, are somewhat changing. And Asia is saying no to that change. And Asia is saying that we would rather be efficient, we would rather adopt whatever technology is there, we would rather adopt the EVs, we would rather. So it's really almost dividing the world into live by the rules that we were taught, the lessons that we learned, or no, let's preserve, whether you want to call it hegemonic space or leadership space or no one else can do technology better than us. I was shocked, and I think most of the people in this room at least must have read that. I was shocked when I read in June 2024 an article, a 14, 15 page, in The Economist saying China is the new scientific, is China the new scientific superpower? Okay, and the length and breadth in those articles or the series of articles that they went to tell us what we are trying not to face, okay? That whether it's universities or citations or the Nature Index, wherever you look, other than, I think they said, biological sciences and one other sciences, China is taking the lead. Now, that can be a lead which we use for the rest of the world, for all of us to grow and prosper, or that could be a lead that we try and use all our energy to stop. Okay? So the base is there. Let's build on the base. I do still tend to look at the world as one. And I do tend to feel very strongly and see very strongly that the US and EU has some advantages which are impossible to imitate or replicate. And the biggest advantage happens to be in your value-based system, which you seem to be foregoing in your quest to engage in a competition which is only half, it's almost looking like looking at half the picture. Because there's the other competition, your soft skills, your soft power, which is what actually got the entire world to coalesce around the rules-based order, which was pretty much written post-World War II winners.
If I read between the, thank you very much for that answer. If I read between the lines, I would throw the ball back to you, Siddharth. Our countries, very west from here, a country you know well, are using the security argument for economic purpose.
I think the answer is no. The reality is there are hard trade-offs on all of these questions, and so if you take something like clean energy or battery technology, there are considerations related to your domestic manufacturing base, and so part of the reason the United States is in such political ferment right now is that there was a sustained hollowing out of the American industrial base over a period of decades, and we are seeing a political reaction to that manifest. And so that's one consideration. A second consideration is dependencies, and so particularly dependencies on China. What you have seen if you look at recent Chinese actions, whether it's cutting off rare earths, going back a decade to Japan, but more recently germanium, gallium, graphite, in an effort to create pressure on Western economies and international economies more generally. That is a concern from a security perspective, and it is not, I think, an economic argument or a security argument masking an economic argument. I think it's a legitimate one. And then the third is there are real security concerns related to the nature of connected technologies in an internet-enabled era. And so, the United States has launched investigations into so-called smart cranes and whether there are backdoors in America's critical infrastructure. That's a concern I think any country would have. It's certainly a concern I know that European countries have, but I think it would range more widely than that. So to answer your question, there are hard trade-offs here, and on any given issue or on any given product, policy makers will have to decide what the balance is. But I don't think we can wish away the trade-off.
I'd like to build on that. There's something we haven't mentioned yet, is the supply chain. Should there be a conflict either with China or within the region, what are the systemic risks in terms of supply chain? I mean, still the world, including the US and Europe, are very still dependent on chips. I mean, most iPhones are manufactured in China. Are we ready?
I think the answer to whether we are ready certainly is no, from a supply chain perspective. I mean, I think when we think about the brittleness of supply chains, there certainly are geopolitical risks, and what looms large is the prospect of increasing tension or even conflict between the United States and China. But we've also just lived through the COVID pandemic, and we saw that the effect that has had on supply chains. We've seen, Houthi rebels impacting shipping in the Red Sea. We've seen that's impact on supply chains. And so I think there is just a broader recognition in the global business community that we need to focus as much on resilience or more on resilience as opposed to exclusively efficiency. And so, people for decades were focused on just-in-time delivery of supply chain and product. I think we are now moving to more of a just-in-case mindset and thinking about, you know, even if it's a little less efficient, what are the redundancies you want to build in? And this is, I think, a very direct and practical question, you know, for global corporations, which is, if you were thinking of your next dollar or your next euro of capital expenditure, is it going to be in China, or do you need to think about somewhere else? And is it potentially India, Southeast Asia? Mexico has been a beneficiary. Here in Europe, both Poland and Hungary have attracted a lot of FDI, all driven by this idea that we need greater flexibility and resilience in supply chains.
Is this exactly a topic where a country like Pakistan, or I'd say all the important regional powers around China and India, could see a relevance in strengthening partnership with the US and Europe?
Say that again?
Question of supply chain disruption. I mean, Pakistan will also be a victim of such a disruption. So is this something that would push you to really partner with Europe and the US?
No, this is a little bit of a, this is where we, I think, from the external lens, get it completely wrong. So a country like Pakistan is desperately, and we've been actually screaming about it, saying that, look, we do not belong in any camp. The camp that we belong in is the Pakistan camp. We do not look at the world as the China camp and the US camp and the EU camp and any other camp. We look at the world as one world, where our future is intrinsically interlinked. To us, as on the receiving end of the climate wrath, as having only contributed less than 1% to emissions and have seen the impact of climate up close and personal in everyday life, there are no climate deniers in Pakistan. So I go back, Greg, to the question that I said, that there are certain public goods which affect all of us. There are countries and regions which have typically done a great job as holding those public goods and ensuring that, whether it's nuclear security, pandemics, these are the threats that I see on the horizon. I don't see the threat of what will, so the threats which are projected in my mind are very different than the threats that we're living through every day. And therefore, one is forced to think that maybe those threats which are perceived are based on interests, which is preservation of perhaps hegemonic interests or whatever you want to call it. And I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth or you put the situation as it is. But we have, look, we're a country, our largest trading partner, our export destinations happens to be Europe. How are we not in the European camp, if there is such a thing as a European camp, right? One of our largest trading partners in terms of export destination is the US, more than China. So our interests are intrinsically interlinked. However, if you allow me to go a little deeper and further into this, when a containment of China becomes like the big picture and the big writer of everything else in terms of policy, we saw a difference in attitude towards us, not because of the US wanting to treat Pakistan differently, because of a country that the US considered to be the net security provider in the China containment policy, in the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States of America, wanting Pakistan to be treated differently by the United States of America, and it all happened, right? We still don't have the choice and say, oh, US, we don't. We absolutely have intrinsically interlinked growth, development. We have a diaspora, a healthy diaspora in the US. So by no means is Pakistan the country which is ever looking to be on the side which is not that of the US, EU, but China is the neighbor. And China is a country which we've had long-term relationships. So why do we have to choose? I mean, we don't ask you to choose between France and...
But that was not the question. Yeah. So I really get it, and it reminds me of what you said very strongly last year, saying, are we allowed not to choose? And this is a comment I have not forgotten. And I think it's what I keep telling each time we have those discussions with Americans, Europeans, there are countries who want to be allowed not to choose. I really get it. My question was rather, in case of a regional conflict, not necessarily between the US and China, it could be between China and India, I mean, who knows, within the next 15 years. Are you prepared for massive supply chain disruptions that would affect, the food system, health, or is it something, and that's my question was, is this something where you would see the US and the EU as, partners to reduce the risk of supply chain disruption?
Yeah, I see every country in the world to be a partner in reducing the supply chain risk disruptions, because I think we all both contribute to it and are threatened by it. That's the real truth,
Definitely
okay?
diplomat.
No. I
Yeah,
genuinely
yeah.
believe that. I think we can't, because you see supply chain disruptions affect, because look, a big problem is that we only see the threats that we see and we don't see the threats that others see, right? And that makes us become very introverted, because we see the threats and we're like, oh, you did this to us, but we don't see what you might have done to others, right? And I feel that we are actually on a path which is self-destructive in wanting to divide the world into various camps, and is actually unlearning the lessons from history in a way which is massive, and just because we're not able to look at the bigger picture, and because we also absorbed into our own threat perceptions the entire world. So I was in office between 2010 to 13, and I went back to office in a different role, but in the same ministry, in 2022, okay? And I was shocked once you went back inside, bilaterals with the US, with China, with Europe, with everyone, as to how scared everyone was. So my big picture was how scared everyone is. So people are reacting to being scared by what others may do, which they may not do on their own. So everybody's in reaction mode. And I have, back in 2010, when I became foreign minister, I said, I do not believe in reactive foreign policy vis-a-vis India. You're not Indian, just saying. But a proactive foreign policy, one which is based on interest. And I do believe that if we are able to find the off-ramp to have conversations, deep conversations, whether it is between China and US, India and Pakistan, China and Europe, I believe there's a solution to every problem. But if we're in the mood to find solutions, if you're in the mood to say, no, we must be prepared for the worst without looking at what are the alternatives, then honestly, the supply chain disruptions would happen, the climate change wrath would worsen up, everything bad would happen, and I'm not trying to put more dangerous things out there. But there is this thing called nuclear security, right? Now, I was shocked that about 2 to 3 years back, we had a missile land in Pakistan, which was, coming in from a place and, a nuclear partner, not a neighbor. And for a few minutes, anything could have been thought, right? And I went back and I thought, had this happened 10 years back, how the world would have reacted to that? And right now, we seem to be on an escalation ladder on every possible ladder that there is, and only wanting to go further and further up. Nobody is looking for an off-ramp. So Europe, we come back to Europe. Europe is the continent and the conglomerate of countries, all diverse, different, etc., which has always been the voice of reason in some ways, right? And the voice of global goods and lessons from history. So if Europe loses that space, I would be very scared, personally.
That's a very important thing. I think the main takeaway. I think it's quite positive for Europe, and it's a call to stay true to ourselves. One point, Siddharth, we saw that Prime Minister Modi announced that India would buy F-35, so congratulations. But we also saw that India has landed on the southern pole of the moon last year. I think it's also a gigantic step forward, positioning India as a massive space power. Do you see India as the longer-term partner in Asia, not just to counter the security threat of China, but also for scientific cooperation and as a defense partner as well in the region?
Yeah, look, I think there is no question that one of the, great success stories from a U.S. perspective of the 21st century really has been the growth and development of the partnership with India. And we see India as an essential partner alongside our other Indo-Pacific partners in this goal that I've described of trying to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. And so, Japan, Australia, India are Quad partners, or in many ways the anchors of that, but it extends further, and certainly in Southeast Asia and beyond, and Korea as well. But on India specifically, I agree with you that I think technology cooperation, particularly actually related to defense technology, has been one of the areas where we have seen the greatest growth and cooperation that would have been unimaginable, even 5-6 years ago. The progress that we've made on co-development of jet engines, which is actually some of the most sophisticated technology in the world. There are more countries that actually build nuclear submarines, not to go back to AUKUS, than build actually the advanced jet engines. And so that is actually an area of technology sharing with India today. There's a working group related to aircraft carrier cooperation. There's space cooperation. There's a whole panoply as biotech becomes much more important. India's leadership in that space is, I think, is going to be something that the United States is going to be more interested in partnering with. And the latest example of that, going back to defense, is this announcement of the F-35 sale. There are going to be a lot of steps that are required, particularly related to information and technology security, to have that sale come to fruition. But I think the scale of the ambition is appropriate to the nature of the relationship.
Yesterday, I had a chat with a defense minister of an important Asian country, and I asked that minister about the competition between India and China and saying, is this a threat? And he said, well, could see it as a threat potentially, but I rather see it as an opportunity of balancing one another. Do you see it that way?
Between China and India? Meaning, look, there's something that happens on the world stage, and then there's its repercussions, fissures in the region. So on the world stage, Siddharth is absolutely right. I think it makes perfect sense for the US to partner with India for China containment, but also for various other reasons. I do not believe the same value system bit too much, because I think in the last 10 years, as someone who celebrated Indian democracy, Indian institutions, even as Foreign Minister of Pakistan, which is not the most normal thing to do. I think India has regressed largely on that and has had the impunity which has been provided to it by the West because of its partnership with India as a containment of China, more than its values going better, right? So freedom of religious freedom, etc. India will get a pass. India will also get a pass to import oil from Russia, etc., which no other country would, because of, so I believe
We're buying the oil from India coming from Russia.
That's a win-win, no? Good, as far as we keep on looking at the world in that way. But China, I would like to live in a world, again, wishful thinking, I would like to live in a world where China and India are part of Asia. Pakistan is right in the middle, so you can understand my wish to do that, which is prospering, growing, developing as a region, and not competing and cutting each other, right? And what I have seen in the last 15 years of the, of the love affair between the United States of America and India is, so I will have to be parochial. I will have to be a Pakistani and say that it has had a terrible impact on Pakistan. I would say that because Pakistan believes itself to be a partner to the US, and Pakistan does not believe that you have to choose to be a partner of one country at the expense of the other. And I also very strongly see, and I'm not saying believe, I'm saying I see, because of facts and not because of my figment of my imagination, that the impunity that has been provided to India by the West in the last 15 years has made India a bit of a rogue country within the region. So it has made it become very, very, liberal in its use of threatening and sending jets into the country to win an election and all of that type of things. I also see that India has swerved away from the values of liberal democracy in a way which is dangerous to me, because I think we lived through that time during Zia's time in Pakistan, General Zia's time in Pakistan. And once you put extremism in the minds and souls of people, it's very difficult to extract it out. So I believe currently India is living through the times of the Nehruvian, Manmohan Singh, reputational India, and not through the current reputation is going to catch up, maybe, and I hope not, because we belong to the region, have a long border. And I like to look at eventually, very fast, not in my children's time, but in my time, hopefully, but certainly do not see it happening even in my children's time, a region which is at peace with each other. Whether China, India, Pakistan, India. I think we have suffered a great deal because this entire region not being able to look at it. You know, I always give the example of the European Union. And even with the exit of UK, you're still a good example, right? So that's the vision that we had. So to me, the fallout of the partnership of, so being very, very selfish, parochial, whatever you want to call me, in saying that the impact of that on the region has been a little bit less desirable.
Well, I remember you saying that India was the, I quote you, darling of the West. So
It is absolutely the rogue darling of the West.
I think we have 25 minutes left, and I'd love to open it to the floor. So we have a microphone somewhere, also, I think. And, or we don't. In that case, you'll just have to ask your question very loudly. Do we have a microphone or don't? Okay. Does someone have a question or? That's the shy audience. Yes, we do. Yes. Great, madam. But we don't have. Okay, right. Happy to share.
Good morning. My name is Edith Wolf from Stuttgart, Vector Foundation. I was wondering when you raised the question on supply chain and nobody was talking about Taiwan and the Taiwan-China threat. How do you see it?
I organize.
Thank you. It's not a question to me, but
Sure, I'm happy to speak to that. Look, I mean, there is no question that Taiwan under the situation across the Taiwan Strait continues to be a serious security risk for the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, but for the region and really for the world. And I think the facts are well known to all. You know, I think 90% of the most advanced semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan, principally by one company. But even when you think of mature node semiconductors of disproportionate share, I think on the order of 50% are still manufactured on China, in Taiwan. And so any disruption in that supply chain would have massive, massive global economic consequences. And you know, people have put out estimates that the hit to the global economy of a disruption in disruption of exports of semiconductors from Taiwan could be on the order of $4 trillion. And so this is of a magnitude that is actually even difficult to conceive of, you know, far bigger than anything that we saw in the global financial crisis. It would be an economic cataclysm for the world. And therefore, all of us have a profound interest in ensuring that peace remains across the Taiwan Strait, and that is a fraught proposition. You know, the Chinese government has been very clear that Taiwan is a red line issue for them, that they see the legitimacy and even the legacy of the Chinese Communist Party being tied to the unification of Taiwan. Having said that, I don't believe conflict is imminent. I think, you know, from the perspective of someone like Xi Jinping, he has to think about the military difficulty of such a task and whether his military is prepared. I think he has doubts about that. He has to think about, as I alluded to, the economic cost of a conflict. And when at a time when China's economy is slowing, I think there are incentives against that. And then he has to think about sort of the blowback politically within China if there is conflict, and particularly if that conflict fails. But there is a crucial role for every country, I believe, to send a message of a commitment to peaceful resolution of differences across the Taiwan Strait. And it's something, you know, the United States has consistently articulated, but it is something importantly the European Union has articulated, the G7, Japan, Australia, and decision makers in Beijing need to consistently hear that so that we can all send them a clear message and hopefully ensure that such a conflict never comes to pass.
I'd be tempted to bounce back on that, but you have precedence. I think that we have a microphone.
Oh, very rich.
Thank you. Heinrich Greff, former German diplomat, currently at the Istanbul Policy Center. We talked a lot about, or you talked a lot about two neighbors, India and Pakistan, India and China, but Afghanistan. So what is your take on the development in your eastern neighbor and relations?
Eastern is India. You
Sorry,
Western.
Western.
Okay, good.
Afghanistan.
Okay, yeah. What could be my take? I mean, we're, for the second time around, living through the consequences of an international adventure into Afghanistan, which has had terrible, terrible consequences. I don't know for the Afghan people, but certainly for its neighbors. We have a flow of refugees, an unmitigated flow of refugees. We share about 2,700-kilometer border with Afghanistan. We were told that there was nation building going to happen, and then one fine day, everything finished, and we were... There are arms and ammunition which has been left in, night vision goggles, really sophisticated ammo, which is being used to butcher our people. And we are trying to create as much of an awareness of that within the region, with Central Asian republics, which are also all immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, are currently facing that security threat that has been left by an unplanned departure. You know, the strong will do what they will, and the weak shall suffer what they must. I think the Afghan people are going through those motions right now. And there is internal security in Afghanistan, which we probably haven't seen before. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that the route that they've taken vis-a-vis how they treat a certain section of women, not a certain section of the people, meaning the women, is something which does not allow even countries which do believe. So a country like Pakistan believes that diplomacy must only be done behind closed doors, right? But when you make a decision like that, and you say because of Islam we can't send women to schools, then we say we are also followers of Islam and we're also Muslims, right? So people can take all sorts of on our side of the border. So, however, that does not, I do not think that it should propel the world from abandoning the 40 million Afghans which are left to suffer the consequences of decisions which were made outside of their hands. So I do not believe that, oh, because we're so democratic, because we believe so much in girls' education, therefore we will abandon the girls to die. That's something I'm never able to understand. And we hope that as maturity prevails and as internal conflicts die down, that a saner, and we will continue, and this is Pakistan, we continue to engage with whatever and whoever is in government in Afghanistan. I think we've all learned this lesson, that none of us can choose who rules a certain country. As neighbors, we don't just have that choice, right? And we just have to, so we are making do with the best we can. And the biggest concern to us, our red line, is our security concerns. Hopefully, if that is something that is taken care of, we hope to be able to live peacefully.
Do we have other questions? Otherwise, I have one for you, Siddharth, based on the question of the lady on Taiwan. Of course, we now all know about the deal that Donald Trump has been talking about with President Putin on Ukraine. To what extent has this, but it's perhaps too fresh, raised the concern amongst your clients about what Donald Trump, the US, might do should there be a conflict in Taiwan? In other words, just cracking a deal with China.
Well, look, I think what I would say is that the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, is something that has been extremely keenly observed in Asia, and countries and places in the region have taken very strong positions on that. You know, the former Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Kishida, has said that what is Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, and he was effectively referencing Taiwan. I think it is very important that Japan has been one of the most staunchest supporters of Ukrainian freedom and Ukraine's right to defend itself. Similarly, Australia has provided very significant both military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. South Korea, also strong supporter, and Taiwan itself. And so, all of which is to say is I think I agree with the linkage that you're making, because it is actually a linkage that leaders in the region have themselves made. You know, we'll see what happens in terms of sort of diplomacy on Ukraine, but there is no question that the region is watching closely, and the region will draw conclusions based on what they see.
So I want to ask Hina, because I love how you talked about zooming out, looking at the bigger picture. And we're trying to have a lot of positive examples of positive futures to solve. Is there an example in your mind of solving a current challenge where you think, looking at the bigger picture between Europe and Pakistan, or Europe and the region, where you can say this is a problem considering climate change or supply chains or whatever, where you think this is a point of intervention where you can immediately act on together?
You're asking me to give an example.
Yeah,
right?
Bigger picture.
Okay. So the
let's draw beyond boundaries.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you two, one which is bigger picture and one which is perhaps a more personal picture, yeah? So the bigger picture is Europe itself. Post-World War I, post-World War II, Europe, warring tribes, warring countries, etc., could come together and become the European Union and talk about a common future. So there was a commonality of future which was seen after you were able to get out of parochial, tribal rivalries and us versus them. So us. And a more personal picture, for instance, I can share with you that in Pakistan, obviously, you know, we have this long historical enmity, animosity, and history, and wars with India, okay? And when I came in as foreign minister, I remember just saying that, okay, no more are we going to write in our briefs, India the enemy, because India the neighbor. That's India the neighbor, okay? And we will not be able to build on any path towards resolution of the Kashmir issue, which both India accepts, has been accepted in the similar agreement, in the United Nations Security Resolution. So when I say India is becoming rogue, is when India says, no, this is our, you know, so this India, if it says that, no, this, yes, it's a Security Council resolution which says disputed territory, this, but now this rogue India says, no, it's a resolved issue, Pakistan live with it. That's a rogue, and it should not be. Now, where we are right now, so I gave you that example in 2000. I think that made a lot of difference, because I tried to make the case that we can't solve the Kashmir issue, not I, we. In the Foreign Office, the political party, Pakistan People's Party, which I'm very proud of, were able to make the case that we cannot resolve the Kashmir issue with India if we don't start speaking to them about everything, start treating them normally, start trading with them. And trade was a no-go area, and we decided, no, let's provide India the MFN status, start treating them normally. And that was a very, very big and costly political move, but we took it as a party because we thought Pakistan's future and the subcontinental future deserved that. And because we had a partner at that time in Manmohan Singh, that path off went very, very well, until things changed, right? I'll give you a more recent example. Because of the first Indo-Pacific strategy that came in the world, was the US one, if I'm not mistaken. Can anyone challenge me on that? I'm not an expert in that, but as far as I know, the first Indo-Pacific strategy that came out was the United States one, right? And a lot of people in Pakistan believed Indo meant India. Indo means the Indian Ocean, right? Despite that, because in that particular strategy, India was considered to be and put in their heart and center as the net security provider for the Indo-Pacific strategy. So there was obviously a lot of reaction in Pakistan. Pakistan, anything Indo-Pacific, no, we're not going to go there, right? Anything. So when the European Indo-Pacific strategy came, and when we were on office, Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, who was the foreign minister at that time, was invited for a meet of the Indo-Pacific, you know, summit or annual conference in Sweden, I remember, in Stockholm. And immediately our reaction was, of course not. And he said, no, let's wait. Let's look at what is Europe's Indo-Pacific strategy. And it was green energy, blue energy, all the goodies, all the good things, all about collaboration, cooperation. And there was, yes, maybe a security element, but we didn't put anyone as a net security provider. And we said, why not? Let's, you know, so really you have to be able to look at, you know, the Think Again. I don't know if you're a fan of Adam Grant. I am. His book, Think Again. We have to sometimes question the things that we take to be given facts and say, do they beat the reality test? So I like to believe that I always say I'm a big believer in God. It's not very fashionable. I believe in, and I always say that in Islam, we do sajda to Allah, right? And after that, if there's anything that I would do sajda is, it's to logic and rational thinking and behavior and everything else. And that's what should define where we're going. So less parochial, more looking at the world. I think I genuinely, having been in this space long enough, I think we all have something good to offer in terms of what we bring to the world. So we need to build on those goods rather than, yeah.
You mentioned climate and the floods in Pakistan, which threaten more than 30 million lives. You are at the forefront of climate change. China has been leading in, as you stressed, science, innovation, research, as well as industry. Climate is a threat multiplier. Do you think, Siddharth, that this could somehow change the way Donald Trump approaches climate?
I'm not going to speculate on, which direction the Trump administration may take. But I think one kind of reality here is that, and the numbers bear this out, we need to keep trying to meet the targets of the IPCC and trying to, keep global warming to 1.5 degrees or whatever, but it is very unlikely that we are going to meet those targets. And so the reality is that regardless of what is happening in the transition, and we must remain committed to the transition, we are also in an era of climate mitigation. And that, I think, is something that is actually is going to become increasingly part of the dialogue globally, but also in the United States. The United States has no option but to invest in mitigation. And that, I think, is actually potentially something the administration could get behind because it has all sorts of implications related to infrastructure and things like that. So, we'll see. I think separately, though, even with all of the changes in policy we've seen just in the last month, there is a still, critical mass of the private sector who is committed to the logic of the green energy transition, both because of its fundamental environmental imperative, but also because it is now increasingly makes business sense. And as the cost curves come down for solar, wind, as we look at nuclear, as we have huge new potential energy requirements related to AI and data centers, there is no question that we have to pursue an all-of-the-above approach, and it's not going to be just a fossil fuel approach.
I mean, you accompany clients all over the world in understanding and anticipating geopolitical risks. When do you talk about Asia, or they come to you to understand Asia? What are the greatest concerns?
I think the biggest story, really from a business perspective, but even really a broader global economic perspective, is the decoupling to a certain degree of the United States and China. It will not happen entirely. It is impossible for it to happen entirely, given how intertwined, how large these economies are. But it is clearly happening to a certain degree in sectors that are defined as strategic. And we saw that most clearly now in advanced semiconductors. But the logic that that has been playing out is that the sort of diagram of what is defined as strategic keeps growing over time. And there is a kind of political logic to that, but there's also a certain economic logic to that. And so we started with advanced node semiconductors. We are looking at dependencies related to legacy node semiconductors. There are concerns about dependencies in the clean energy space that we've talked about in this conversation. There are concerns that are increasing and that I think you are likely to see policy action coming out of Washington on related to dependencies in the biotechnology and life sciences space. President Trump has talked about placing tariffs on pharmaceuticals specifically. And so the range of ways in which there will be sort of pressure on supply chains, and particularly supply chains that are dependent on China, is growing. And it's not just driven by Western policymaking or US policymaking, it's also been driven by changes in China itself. I alluded to its slowdown in economic growth. Wages are increasing in China. The business environment in terms of requirements for technology transfer, in terms of lax protections for intellectual property, have all in some sense made it less attractive. And so this is the big story from my perspective, and something we discuss with companies around the world. The world that developed over the last 40 years, defined by peak globalization, by lean, just-in-time supply chains, by a concentration of dependence on China, is being unwound. And that is going to be a decades-long process, and it's one that we must all adapt to.
Hina, how is Pakistan and the region, because again, as a foreign minister, you travel across the region, has felt this deglobalization? And do you actually feel deglobalization?
No, I mean, when you use a word as strong as decoupling, it's almost like you're talking about a world which has been completely integrated and it's enmeshed and integrated, and whether it's supply chains or efficiencies or everybody takes whatever, and then you want to sort of literally, and I think what Asia is doing is basically being the resistance band. It's literally because Asia has seen the positive consequences of globalization. If you look at the Southeast Asia, the Asian tigers, we remember that entire decade, 2 decades of the Asian tigers, Indonesia, Thailand, everyone emerging in a really big way, right? And then there were countries like Pakistan, India, for instance, in the first few decades of that time, was very closed economy, opened up, saw the benefits. So by and large, the story of the world is having seen the benefits of globalization in a way which has had its impacts. Yes, inequality, perhaps in certain way, it hasn't been managed very well. But you know, in some ways, China has done it differently than anyone else, right? And they were still able to get a large amount of people, large number of people outside. So I think it's very scary to most of Asia, whether you look at Central Asian republics, certainly Southeast Asia, certainly most of South Asia, and even the Middle East, which is terribly, by terribly I mean in the positive way, which is deeply integrated with the global supply chain system, with its, you know, with Dubai port. So we are already, so you're saying an integrated world should now be camped as integrated with one and perhaps not with the other. It's a difficult sell. So when you say that this will be a decades-long process, I just ask myself the question that, is the cost that is going to come from being able to achieve that worth what we're trying to, what are we doing it for? You know, it's like, again, logical, rational thinking. What's the end objective? Is it, and when I look, again, from a foreign policy lens and from a developing country lens, at the great dangers of climate change, pandemics, AI, regulation of AI, laws, lethal autonomous weapons, which are being played around in the Middle East. Okay, who is handling the global goods? And I say, it's this part of the world which we are used to handling the global goods. Okay, and you're saying no. That's no is a difficult no for Asia, I think, and I think Asia will take a while before completely understanding that, okay, the door is closed. I'm just still hoping that they'll keep on knocking and the door will open.
So the screen here says I have 1 minute left, which means I could either ask you the USAID question, or we just look back at the title, Navigating the Eastern Century, and I would rather go for that one. Yeah, I'm sure you will agree. So both of you are on the boat and trying to navigate the Eastern Century, and I'd like to ask you, what is the main challenge you see on the horizon, and how, in a few words, you think we can address it? You didn't expect that, huh?
Gentleman's prerogative.
Well, I'm happy to kick off. You know, what I'm tempted to say about navigating the Eastern Century is what Chou and Lai said about the French Revolution, which is it's too soon to tell. And you know, this is going to be the story of the century. It will play out over decades. But I think the principal challenge will be trying to uphold a vision of the region, as I alluded to, that the majority of countries can actually buy into. And again, I think there are principles that define that, but what contends against that is the vision of sort of one power seeking to dominate other powers in the region. And that is the push and pull that we are seeing unfolding. And the principal challenge from a US policy perspective, but really for all of us, is to manage that peacefully.
Okay, so I'm thinking, should I go at it philosophically or should I go at it from a completely economic and political point of view? And I'm just going to quickly do the philosophical part and, 2 lines on that and 1 line on the other. So I think philosophically speaking, or looking at Asia or the Eastern century as we're looking at it, or the Eastern reality, I think Eastern people, countries, are generally much less dogmatic in what is the only approach to life, okay? And we are also generally very respectful of your own space, your own way of thinking, which is supposed to be liberal values, by the way, as we knew them, right? That you have a right to. And that, you manage your house, you know how best to manage, because we don't feel we have the place to tell you how to manage your house, how to manage your country, etc. That's a very Eastern value. That's a very, very... And that is largely seen in various Eastern cultures in one way or the other, whether you look at the Pakistani culture or the Indian culture or the Uzbek culture, families reign supreme in many ways, and, businesses are also built around that. But, so that's the Asian, if it is truly an Eastern century, it is going to be one which is based on a value system which is very accepting of a different type of approach to life, way of doing things, etc. It's not very dogmatic. It's not saying my way or the highway. And the other answer, the more pragmatic answer to that is that the Eastern century is seeing the headwinds coming in from being allowed to live the century, okay? So it's almost like the Eastern reality or the Asian reality is a real one. If you look at the demographics, if you look at the contribution to GDP, if you look at all the realities, if you look at technology transfer, if you look at adoption of technology, because sometimes you go to Eastern countries now, Asian countries, and the bandwidth is better. People are using mobile phones for bank transactions far more than European. I mean, it's remarkable, right? So there is that thing happening, but will the headwinds from, as I said, are we propelling through the Asia pivot, through all of that? Are we propelling this, or are we trying to subvert it? And I think that's really would be the concern. And that's a concern that I see, whether it's in the Central Asian republics or the Southeast Asian. I think that's something that people are talking about. And decoupling, I think, is not something which is, I don't know of any country in the world, in Asia, other than India maybe, where decoupling is celebrated.
Well, I think this was a remarkable tour de force. I think we definitely navigated the Eastern century, and I thank you very, very much. This has been a tremendous discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.